What makes VHS or analog horror any good is a question I've had on my mind after watching the short film, The Kid and the Camera. I've had this question in my mind because I have to say The Kid and the Camera is the absolute best example of good VHS or analog horror, and sometimes when people attempt this genre, they fail. Badly. So you know what? Let's look at some shorts that do this genre of horror well to see what makes them so good. For my first example, let's have a look at a short I already mentioned just before. As I said before, this is a short that's up on YouTube that imitates a kids' television show extremely well. It literally looks like something you would see on Nick Jr. from the claymation work to even the kid-friendly TV channel Watermark. But basically, the short's about a kid named Kalen and his camera as he received it as a present. He loves his camera and takes photos of everything he sees, with the photos being real photos of a dog and a ball. Keep the real photos thing in mind because it comes back later on. But one day he accidentally breaks his camera after falling over a branch. So eventually, one night whilst Kalen's trying to sleep, he hears a knock on his window to see this demon. Bro, there's your warning sign right there, don't trust this fucking thing. But this thing is called a Kips Need, and he explains to Kalen that he's a sleep fairy and he's wondering why Kalen isn't sleeping. So Kalen ends up telling the Kips Need that they broke their camera and that's why they haven't been sleeping. So eventually the Kips Need tells Kalen to follow him to a portal to his dimension so he can get his camera fixed. The Kips Need disappears into the night as Kalen ends up following them as they are calling out to Kalen to follow him. Kalen ends up in an abandoned house where they hear the Kips Need still calling out to Kalen to follow him, and from here all we see is photos of the house as Kalen goes in and eventually gets lured into the basement. A little cheeky detail here that you might not notice on a first viewing is when it goes to real photos of the house, the watermark disappears. But eventually when Kalen's in the basement, he snaps one last photo of the bottom half of a man as the screen cuts to black, and then this happens.
Some weeks later, authorities discovered the basement. The rest of the boy was never found.
The first time I saw this, I actually got chills. It's so well executed and is an extremely believable twist that the Kips Need is a puppet or possibly a costume that the man put on to lure children out to their demise. The thing I love about this short so much is that it feels like a very real and disturbing situation that could happen, and because of that, it's actually scary. And the fact that it's analog horror is only used to elevate the material. You can't tell me that this wouldn't be scary if it wasn't VHS quality. But with the fact that this imitates a kid's show so well really helps it with the VHS aesthetic. I also think that presenting something as nice and innocent to then have your expectations slowly but eventually flipped on its head where the reality of the situation hits you works very well, and this is a great example of that. Now, this is quite different to the last entry I just talked about, as this is an online series that takes inspiration from the FNAF franchise. Also, this is a full-blown series compared to the last entry where it's just a one-off thing. So the whole series has a story going on that still hasn't been completely told, as they're meant to be 6 episodes with only 3 being out so far. We get hints to some beats of the story, or even with the 3rd episode Bunny Farm, where something in the Bunny Farm game posing itself as a glitch literally shows the main character a plot event that happened in the past where the co-founder of Bond's Burgers, Felix Kranken, killed Jack Walton's, the other co-founders, 2 kids, Eddie and Molly, in a drunk driving accident when taking them home from a school dance. Personally, what I think works so well about the series is that it imitates a Chuck E. Cheese or Showbiz Pizza quite well, especially with the first episode imitating a typical introductory tape that these companies had in the past with using different art styles. While I'm talking about art styles, I really think that the art style of the realistic looking animatronics is really cool. Obviously, you don't believe that it's completely real, but it definitely works for what it's trying to do and really differentiates them from when they're in their cartoon form. But even the series has 2 spin-off episodes, but my favourite one has to be the mysterious house. It's all about a wolf named Tammy and a duck named Ducky. Very original. But the whole episode poses itself as a made-for-VHS short that kids should watch around the Halloween season. The episode follows Tammy and Ducky as they are out trick-or-treating on Halloween night, where they decide to go to one final house for the night. The house they chose is literally the worst house possible, as it's sitting in darkness with 2 of the windows barricaded, but of course they decide to still knock on the door. They get invited into the house for candy by a person named Witch Sheep, as she introduces Tammy and Ducky to her friends. Eventually they get candy from the Pumpkin Rabbit, as TVA, this thing, takes a photo of them. The Pumpkin Rabbit then insists on them staying the night, as his voice is honestly quite menacing. Also, I see that cheeky little Easter egg to The Shining with the floorboards. But as Ducky and Tammy are going to leave to go home, the Pumpkin Rabbit suggests that they stay the night, interrupting Tammy as she's talking, and eventually they decide to stay. When they stay the night, things take a turn for the worst as Ducky eventually leaves the room and Tammy wakes up to realize that Ducky's gone. Tammy goes to search for them as they hear their voice calling out, and while searching for Ducky, they come across Billy.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
In the corner. Eventually, Tammy gets to a hallway with a bunch of doors on both of the walls, so they open a few doors to try and find Ducky until they find them. But as Tammy walks in, we see the witch sheep standing behind them and slowly approaching them, but instead of following Tammy into the room, they just wait at the door, as Tammy then finally sees what happened to Ducky, and now they look like lasagna. Tammy then sees all the other people in the photos as they have been murdered, as distorted music is playing in the background, and eventually the Pumpkin Rabbit approaches Tammy, asking what they're doing here. But of course, Tammy's completely fucked as the Pumpkin Rabbit reveals their face before killing them, and the episode ends with Tammy's mutilated face. Sure, this has the typical analog horror tropes with distorted faces, but I really think that it's the build-up with this disturbing art style that really makes this work. It's how Martin Walls built up the atmosphere in this episode that actually makes it scary and well done, and the fact that this doesn't end with someone surviving really subverts your expectations, then ends the episode in a dark way. I think that this is the most believable and yet kind of relatable analog horror series I've seen. Let me explain. This series really imitates the feeling of waking up to your TV on a random TV channel in the middle of the night. I will also say that the style of this series being like a TV channel with people hijacking the channel is really cool, even though the VHS effect does get a bit much for me, as some segments just don't look like it was from a VHS tape. But in this series, instead of people hijacking the channel, it's apparently extraterrestrial entities doing it. Which, if you ask me, it kind of takes a bit away from the series, just making it about aliens, as it starts off as a believable thing that could really happen, then when aliens come into the picture, it kind of breaks the realism for me. Also, I just found this out now, but apparently this is a spin-off of the old creepypasta called Candle Cove, which the more I think about that comparison, the more it makes sense. There really isn't much else to say about this series, as it's quite short but effective.
Wow, that's a lot of shrimp.
At Red Lobster.
Yes, this video is a great choice. But I do want to get my one nitpick out of the way. The start of this short is quite pointless to me, besides from it being a way just to subvert your expectations at the start with adding a kayfabe jump scare to the end of the THX intro, which you would mostly find on DVDs and not VHS tapes. But after that, where it actually starts is great, as they imitate a Red Lobster commercial to a T, and if you ask me, I don't think this is a VHS filter. I think they actually ran the footage through a VHS tape and recorded that. Which honestly, if you want it to look as real as possible, run your footage through a VHS tape and record it. That is the best way to do it. This short is kind of a too many cooks situation, but instead of it being about how shows can change when there are too many people in control of a show, this shows a woman as she seems to realize that she's in a Red Lobster commercial that's on repeat. As she realizes this, the commercial slowly falls apart with the actors acting differently and even the narrator changing what he says and even malfunctioning for a moment. But it gets violent as she isn't following the script of the commercial, and eventually when she attacks the man back, the whole commercial just breaks for a minute as everyone's in the wrong positions. Eventually it goes back to the start of the commercial where we hear the narrator say,
At Red Lobster, at this point in time, die forever unless you stop him from saying his line. Stop.
Where she stabs him and cuts his tongue out to stop him from saying his lines. But this is where it really all comes together, as everyone in the room besides her go white with red eyes and are basically possessed as she runs past them and goes out the door to end up at a drug rehabilitation group. We find out that she's been off drugs for 30 days as they congratulate her for that achievement, but we see the waiter banging out the window as the temptation to get back on drugs is always there. I think this meaning to the whole short film is fantastic, as drugs can be a constant cycle until you die unless you break the cycle, and this short shows that in such a unique and interesting way. I do want to mention that this short did really well in 2017 and 2018, with it going to Sundance, Toronto, and the BFI London Film Festival, with it being nominated for Best Short at Sundance in Toronto. This short did get quite a bit of controversy from Red Lobster, as they obviously didn't like how the short showed their company, and because of that, it was very hard to find copies of the short until about 3 months ago, where it was found and uploaded to YouTube. I think Red Lobster needs to realize that the short isn't about the company in the commercial at all. It's only used as a means to convey the message in the short, because it doesn't have to be Red Lobster. It could be about any company and it would still be just as effective. I just think that they chose Red Lobster in this commercial specifically to imitate it because it was easier to imitate, and they imitated the original commercial extremely well. There is an interesting theory about this short that is quite believable. The theory says that this short is a Red Lobster commercial because that was one of the main character's last memories before doing drugs and getting addicted to drugs, so she constantly lives the cycle of that commercial she remembers. They do add on to the theory to say that the waiter is her dealer, but I'm honestly not sure about that. Overall, I did notice that a lot of analog horror is structured like PSAs now, but a lot of them don't understand what makes a PSA effective. Besides, great choice. Also, I do think that the so-called lost PSA Hitogata could count as a VHS or analog horror series, because I honestly believe that this PSA has never existed, but was a PSA that someone didn't remember correctly. But there are great examples of analog horror out there. It's just the fact that a lot of other analog horror shorts or series do the same thing over and over again is what puts a sour taste in people's mouths with the genre of horror. Kinda like the horror genre itself. I will say, I would love to see some PSA horror show up and be integrated into analog horror, as I think it could be fantastic, as a lot of PSAs stand up with analog horror, and in my opinion, some get even scarier and more disturbing. I think that Great Choice is a great stepping stone for someone to do more like a PSA analog horror. Thanks guys for watching the video, but you know what to do now. Make sure to comment down below what your favorite analog horror series is and discuss analog horror series in the comments. Also, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like. Make sure to subscribe if you enjoy my content as well. And anyways, let's get into the shoutouts. Alright, massive thanks to Ash Crimson for supporting my channel license tier. And lastly, massive thanks to Fatima and Victoria Huntley for supporting my Big Boss tier. If you want to find out how you can get my videos early, make sure to sign up to my YouTube memberships by clicking the join button, or make sure to sign up to my Patreon, which the link is in the description. Anyways, I'll see you on the next one.